Last year, my life took a turn I never anticipated. My in-laws, Emily and Robert, tragically passed away in a car accident, leaving behind a substantial inheritance for my husband Daniel, our two kids, Maggie, 7, and Ethan, 5, and me. Emily and Robert had been extremely prudent with money. Emily worked as a lawyer, and Robert owned a successful business. Over the years, they saved every penny they could, building a small fortune. Daniel and I already live comfortably, so we decided the inheritance would be dedicated to securing our kids' future, covering their education, and saving for milestones down the road. I wish I could say everyone was on the same page about that plan. At my in-laws' funeral, while the grief was still fresh, my parents cornered me the moment the last guest left. They didn't waste any time getting to the point, demanding I split the inheritance in half, with my sister, Marion, who's 39. According to them, Marion desperately needed a break after her traumatic divorce. But since she didn't have a job or savings, I, as her sister, was morally obligated to fund her vacation. I stood there stunned, unable to believe what I was hearing. Growing up, Marion was always the golden child, the star student, the winner of every competition. She had countless friends and excelled at everything she touched. Meanwhile, I was quieter, more reserved, and while I was also a straight-A student, none of my accomplishments seemed to matter as much. If Marion came home with a participation ribbon, it went on display in our living room for months. My perfect scores? They barely warranted a passing good job. It wasn't always easy growing up in her shadow, but I eventually accepted the fact that no matter how hard I tried, I'd never be enough for my parents. Marion was their miracle baby after years of miscarriages and heartbreak. By the time I came along, I was just another child. They had their perfect daughter, and I was just there. So I stopped trying to compete, instead focusing on myself, my education, and eventually my family. Marion went on to do great things, graduating as valedictorian, attending an Ivy League school, and even starting a business with her boyfriend. But soon after her first taste of success, she cut off all contact with our family. My parents were crushed, clinging to the hope that she'd come back someday. 2 years later, Marion reappeared out of the blue, full of promises to rebuild relationships, only to ask for more money for her business. My parents, overjoyed to have her back, gave her everything she asked for. And then, just as quickly as she had come, she disappeared again. That cycle repeated itself over the years. We'd hear rumors about her, how her business failed, how she got married and divorced, but she never reached out to us directly. Last year, after 15 years of silence, she showed up at my parents' doorstep again, broke, jobless, and looking for a place to stay. My parents welcomed her with open arms, just as they always had. Despite everything she had done, she was still their golden child. At my in-laws' funeral, the conversation with my parents escalated quickly. They insisted that giving Marion half of the inheritance was the right thing to do, because she had suffered so much. When I refused, explaining the money was strictly for my kids' future, my mother lost it. She screamed at me, calling me ungrateful and accusing me of being selfish. She went as far as to say they'd cut me and my family off if I didn't comply, and just like that, they did. I wish I could say I was surprised, but I wasn't. My parents have always been quick to choose Marion over me. It's been their pattern for as long as I can remember. But what hurt the most was knowing how much my kids loved their grandparents. Cutting off contact wasn't just hard for me, it was devastating for them too. Yet I couldn't cave. Not this time. 6 months later, my mother called me. I didn't pick up because I assumed it was about Marion. Then my father called, which was unusual enough that I answered without so much as a hello. He launched into a rant about how Marion had taken a significant amount of money from them and disappeared again. It was the same story I'd heard so many times before. Now my parents wanted to meet me for lunch to apologize and rebuild our relationship. I wanted to believe they were sincere, but I couldn't. They only reached out to me when Marion abandoned them. The moment she returned, they'd forget about me again. I told my father I wasn't interested in reconciling and hung up. It hurt to set that boundary, but I knew I had to protect myself and my family from the toxic cycle my parents refused to break. After that call with my dad, I couldn't shake the mixture of guilt and frustration boiling inside me. On one hand, I felt terrible for cutting off my parents. They raised me, after all. and a part of me still wanted to believe they could change. But deep down, I knew better. Every time Marion left, they turned to me, the backup daughter, to patch things up, to be their emotional safety net. And every time she returned, I was forgotten, like a disposable bandage. I couldn't go back to that, not for my sake and certainly not for my kids. For a few weeks, things were quiet. My husband, Daniel, could see I was torn. He never pushed me to reconcile, but he listened whenever I needed to vent. He agreed that my parents weren't good for us, but he admitted he felt sorry for them. "They're your parents," he'd say, "and they're clearly hurting." I'd just nod, unable to respond because I didn't know how to explain the years of hurt they'd put me through without sounding cruel or ungrateful. Then my parents started calling Daniel. They knew I wasn't picking up their calls, so they thought he'd be an easier target. At first, he was polite, listening to their apologies and excuses, but after a while, he began cutting the calls short. I could tell the constant barrage was wearing on him, too. He didn't want to make things worse, but he also didn't want to undermine my decision to keep them out of our lives. Around this time, my kids started asking questions. Maggie and Ethan wanted to know why they hadn't seen Grandma and Grandpa in so long. It was heartbreaking. Maggie, especially, loved spending weekends baking cookies with my mom. Ethan adored playing catch in the backyard with my dad. I struggled to find the right words. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to burden my kids with adult problems they couldn't understand. Eventually, I just told them that Grandma and Grandpa needed some space right now and that we'd see them when things were better. It wasn't the full truth, but it was the best I could do. About a month after my dad's call, my resolve started to waver. My parents had been trying so hard to reach out, and for a moment I wondered if maybe, just maybe, they were sincere this time. I talked to Daniel about it, and he reminded me of all the times I'd been hurt before. "If you really want to give them another chance, I'll support you," he said. "But you've come so far, and you deserve peace. Don't let guilt pull you back into their cycle." He was right, as usual, but it didn't make the decision any easier. Then came the call that broke me. My mother, crying so hard I could barely understand her, she said she missed me, she missed my kids, and she wanted to see us. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them for lunch. I told myself I wasn't doing it for them, I was doing it for Lucia. For once I wanted to see if they'd truly changed, or if this was just another act to pull me back into their orbit. The lunch started awkwardly. My parents were overly sweet, almost saccharine. My dad apologized for everything, saying he regretted neglecting me as a child. My mom, uncharacteristically quiet, murmured an apology of her own. I sat there listening, waiting for the catch. It felt rehearsed, like they were saying what they thought I wanted to hear, and then, as if on cue, my mom brought up Marion. She wanted me to reconsider sharing the inheritance. "She's been through so much," my mom said. "You're her sister. You should help her." My patience snapped, and I reminded them again that the money was for my kids. "Marion didn't even know Emily and Robert," I said. "Why should she get a dime of their hard-earned money?" My mom waved it off, saying it didn't matter. Marion deserved a break. And then she said the one thing that sealed the deal: "You're just wasting that money on your kids. They wouldn't know how to use it even if you handed it to them." My blood boiled. My kids, my sweet, innocent kids who loved their grandparents, were now being insulted because I wouldn't give up the money. I stood up, trembling with anger, and unleashed everything I'd been holding in for years. I told them how it felt to be second best my entire life, how nothing I did was ever good enough for them, how they always forgave Marion for everything, but punished me for even existing. Tears streamed down my face as I told them I was done. I was done being their backup, done being the one who picked up the pieces every time Marion broke their hearts. I stormed out without waiting for a response. My only thought was to get home and hold my kids tight. After that explosive lunch, I thought I'd made myself clear. I wanted nothing to do with my parents or Marion anymore. I went home, hugged my kids, and told Daniel everything. He wasn't surprised. I think he'd been expecting something like this to happen. "You did what you had to do," he said. "They'll never understand unless you set those boundaries." But deep down, I wasn't sure if setting boundaries with people who had none was even possible. For a few weeks, things were quiet again. and I started to feel like I could finally breathe. My parents hadn't reached out, and for once, I wasn't constantly bracing for the next blow. The kids stopped asking about their grandparents as much, though I could tell they missed them. Maggie made a card for Grandma one afternoon, and it broke my heart to gently remind her that we wouldn't be able to deliver it. She didn't cry, but her little shoulders slumped, and it was all I could do to hold back my own tears. Then, just when I thought I might finally have some peace, the doorbell rang one evening as we were sitting down for dinner. Daniel went to answer it, and when he called my name, I knew it wasn't good. I walked to the door, and there they were, my parents and Marion. My dad held a bottle of wine, my mom carried a dish of food, and Marion stood there with that smug, self-satisfied grin I'd grown to despise. They invited themselves in before I could even process what was happening, heading straight to the dining room. I just stood there, frozen, trying to understand how they could be so brazen. After a few moments, I followed them, finding my parents fawning over Maggie and Ethan. The kids looked confused and uncomfortable, but they didn't say anything. I quickly took them upstairs, telling them to play in their rooms for a while. When I went back downstairs, the three of them were sitting at the table like nothing had happened, chatting and laughing. I asked them, as calmly as I could, what they thought they were doing. They acted clueless, my mom waving her hand dismissively. "Marion's back!" she said, as if that explained everything. My patience, already hanging by a thread, snapped. I reminded them that Marion had stolen from them, abandoned them, and only came back when she needed something. "Do you really think this time will be any different?" I asked. My mom just shrugged. "She's our daughter," she said. "She's been through a lot, and she needs us." And then they started in on the latest saga of Marion's love life. She'd been in a relationship with a married man who'd promised her the world. She paid his rent, using my parents' money, and then, when he didn't leave his wife, she cheated on him with another man. When that relationship fell apart, she moved in with someone else and repeated the cycle. My parents didn't see this as a problem. They saw it as Marion being unlucky. "She just hasn't found the right person yet," my mom said. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I couldn't believe they were still so blind to her behavior. "This is what she does," I said. "She takes and takes and takes until there's nothing left, and then she moves on. Why can't you see that?" But they didn't want to hear it. They never did when it came to Marion. To them, she was still their perfect golden child. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked them what they wanted from me. My mom, looking almost offended, said, "We just want you to support your sister. She deserves that inheritance as much as you do, maybe more, considering everything she's been through." That was it. I told them to leave. My family hadn't even eaten dinner yet because of their intrusion, and I was done playing host to people who didn't respect me or my boundaries. As they left, I made one concession. I promised to meet them at their house for lunch the following week. I just wanted them out of my home. I figured I'd deal with whatever drama they had planned later. But as soon as they were gone, I felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. No matter what I did, it was never enough to break this cycle. Marion would always be the star, and I'd always be the afterthought. I'll share what happened at that lunch and how everything escalated further in Part 4. Stay tuned, because things only got worse from there. I didn't want to go to that lunch. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to cancel, block their numbers, and never look back. But a tiny part of me, the part that still craved some semblance of validation from my parents, dragged me out of the house that day. I kept telling myself it was closure. Maybe this time I could finally say everything I needed to say and leave it all behind for good. When I arrived at their house, Marion was already there, lounging on the living room couch like she owned the place. She looked up when I walked in, flashing that smug smile of hers. Neither of us said a word. My mom came bustling in, all cheerful and fake, announcing that lunch was ready. I followed them to the dining room, sitting down at the table with a growing sense of dread. For the first few minutes, it was small talk. My dad asked about Daniel, the kids, and my job. It was almost civil, like we were a normal family, but I could feel it coming. That shift, when the pleasantries drop and the real reason for the meeting surfaces, it started with my mom, who wasted no time diving straight to the point. "The inheritance," she said, as if we were discussing the weather. We've been thinking about it, and we really believe it's only fair to share it with Marion." I froze, gripping my fork tightly. "Fair?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's fair about giving her money that was meant for my kid's future?" My mom waved her hand dismissively. "She's been through so much. You don't understand how hard it is for her. She deserves a break." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "She didn't even know Emily and Robert," I said. "She has no connection to them. Why should she get anything?" My mom just shrugged as if that detail didn't matter. "Family helps family," she said. "You've always had an easier life. You owe this to her." That's when I lost it. I told them again that the money was for my kids, Maggie and Ethan, who they claimed to love. My mom didn't even flinch. Instead, she said something that hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're wasting it on those kids. They wouldn't know what to do with it even if you spelt it out for them." I felt my face flush with anger. I stood up, shaking, and let it all out. I told them how I'd felt my entire life, like I was never good enough, never their priority, no matter what I did. I told them how Marion got away with everything while I was constantly criticized, how they forgave her every mistake but punished me for things I didn't even do. "And now," I said, my voice breaking, "you're insulting my kids just because I won't give in to your ridiculous demands." They didn't say a word. My mom looked angry like I was the one being unreasonable. My dad just stared at his plate, silent as always. Marion had the nerve to smirk, as if the whole scene amused her. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and stormed out, tears streaming down my face as I drove home. For days after that lunch, I replayed the scene in my head, wondering if I'd been too harsh. But every time I thought about my mom's words and her dismissive attitude toward my kids, I knew I'd done the right thing. Daniel was supportive, as always, but even he couldn't fully understand the weight of it all. Then, a week later, they showed up at my house again. Just my parents this time, no Marion in sight. They looked tired, almost defeated. I didn't let them inside, meeting them on the front porch instead. My mom started crying immediately, saying Marion had left again. I didn't even have to ask what happened. It was always the same story. She took their money, made promises she never intended to keep, and disappeared. My mom blamed me, of course. She said if I'd just given Marion half the inheritance, she would have stayed. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. "Do you really think she'd use that money for you?" I asked. "She'd take it and never look back, just like she always does." My mom didn't like that answer. She started yelling, accusing me of being selfish and heartless. My dad, for once, spoke up. He said he was tired of waiting for Marion to change, tired of the constant heartbreak. But I didn't believe him. If he truly felt that way, he would have stood up to my mom years ago. He would have defended me, protected me, and been the father I needed, but he didn't. Not then, and not now. They begged to see my kids before they left, but I refused. I couldn't let them hurt my children the way they'd hurt me. I told them firmly that if they didn't stop trying to contact us, I'd file a restraining order. They looked shocked, but I meant every word. It was the only way to protect my family from their endless cycle of chaos. I'll share what happened next in Part 5, where I finally took steps to find peace and let go of the toxic hold my parents had on my life. Stay tuned, because this was the moment everything changed for good. After that final confrontation on the porch, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. My parents had made it clear they weren't going to respect my boundaries. They showed up uninvited, ignored everything I said, and continued to make me feel like I wasn't enough. I was exhausted, not just emotionally, but physically too. I'd spent so much time being angry, hurt, and on edge that I barely recognized myself anymore. Something had to change, and it had to start with me. The first thing I did was follow through on my threat. I filed a restraining order. I hated that it had come to this, but I knew it was the only way to create a safe boundary. It wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about protecting my family. I didn't want Maggie and Ethan to grow up in the shadow of this toxic dynamic, watching their mom constantly put herself last. They deserved better, and honestly, so did I. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control, knowing that my parents couldn't just barge into my life whenever they felt like it was a huge relief. It wasn't easy, though. The guilt crept in often, whispering that I was a bad daughter, that I was abandoning them. I'd lie awake at night, replaying old memories, moments when my parents had been kind or supportive, wondering if I'd made the right choice. Daniel was my rock through all of it. He reminded me that setting boundaries didn't make me a bad person. It made me someone who valued her own peace. "You've spent your whole life giving them chances they don't deserve," he said one night. "It's okay to choose yourself for once." The kids adjusted quicker than I expected. They stopped asking about their grandparents as often, and while I could see they still missed them sometimes, they seemed to understand in their own way. One evening, Maggie said something that brought me to tears. "It's okay, Mommy. We still have you and Daddy." She was only 7, but in that moment, she seemed wiser than I'd ever felt. As the weeks went by, I started focusing more on my own family. I threw myself into planning little adventures with the kids, movie nights at home, trips to the park, baking disasters in the kitchen. For the first time in a long time, I felt happy, truly happy. The weight of my parents' expectations and constant disappointments started to lift. But of course, my parents didn't stay quiet forever. A few weeks after the restraining order was filed, I got a letter in the mail. It was from my dad. The envelope was plain, the handwriting neat. I hesitated before opening it, bracing myself for whatever guilt trip or accusations they'd come up with this time. To my surprise, the letter wasn't angry. It was sad. My dad wrote about how sorry he was for everything and how he wished he'd been a better father to me. He admitted that he'd let my mom dictate everything in their lives, including how they treated me. He said he regretted all of it. The neglect, the favoritism, the way they dismissed my feelings. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, he really meant it. But as I read on, I realized the letter wasn't just an apology, it was also a plea. He wanted me to lift the restraining order to let them back into my life. He said they'd changed, that they wanted to be better, but I couldn't ignore the pattern. Every time they said they'd change, they reverted the second Marion came back into the picture. I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to get sucked back in. Instead, I tucked the letter away in a drawer, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I needed the reminder that I'd made the right choice. Months passed, and for the first time, my life felt calm. There was no drama, no unexpected visits, no phone calls filled with yelling and guilt. I focused on my marriage, my kids, and myself. I started therapy, something I'd put off for years, and it helped me work through a lot of the pain I'd carried from my childhood. Eventually, I realized something important. I wasn't responsible for my parents' happiness. I couldn't fix them. I couldn't make them love me the way I'd always wanted. And that was okay. Letting go didn't mean I didn't care. It meant I cared enough about myself to walk away. I don't know if I'll ever fully reconcile with my parents. Maybe someday, when the kids are older, I'll feel ready to try again. But for now, I'm at peace. For the first time in my life, I'm not the backup daughter. I'm just me, a mother, a wife, and someone who finally chose to put herself first. Story 2. Greetings from our Girl Connections. We discuss issues that individuals encounter in their daily lives on this channel. First, let's watch a video. There is no denying that I like my wife, but our relationship has suffered greatly as a result of her type of obsession with her older sister. Since our marriage about a year ago, my wife's sister has been by our side. She has 5 children who are unable to maintain composure, is divorced, and is now seeing a man. My sister-in-law informed my wife that she would not approve of my proposal because she did not think I was a good fit for her. In an attempt to persuade her, my wife forced me to see her several times so we could speak. I thought she was crazy because she would ask dumb questions. Despite the fact that it was completely unnecessary, we were able to win her approval. However, my wife was unable to make decisions without consulting her sister, which led to a number of disagreements between us. I adored her. Good didn't back down due to her sister. After we were married, my sister-in-law brought her 5 children to our home and informed them that she would be visiting for a few days. We could require her assistance. She pretended to be extremely kind and would take care of everything, including cooking and cleaning. However, her children would break anything that could break as they ran around the house. My house became a circus as a result, and I became tired rather than relaxed. After spending a few days here, my sister-in-law returned to her home. Although saying goodbye to her was a huge relief, I knew she wouldn't be around for long. After my wife informed her sister that we were organizing our honeymoon, she sent us a list of potential locations. She was eager to learn every aspect and was quite thrilled. We made a decision after informing her of the destination. She claimed that she had always wanted to visit, but was unable to do so. We ended a conversation in the group chat by expressing our hope that she will eventually get the opportunity to visit there. She showed up at our house the next day and said she was joining us. I informed her that she couldn't accompany us because it was our honeymoon and not just any regular trip. She expressed to my wife her desire to see that location and her disappointment at never being able to do so. I was shocked when my wife informed her that we would consider it because we were unable to even consider it. I questioned my wife about how she could let someone accompany us on our honeymoon after my sister-in-law left. She told me she could accompany us and that neither she nor her sister deserved to be happy. I informed my wife that her sister would not be joining us. I informed my wife that we would take her sister on a different trip despite her attempts to persuade me otherwise. However, the honeymoon was exclusively for us. After being persuaded, my wife apologized to her sister, who became agitated and hung up. The phone call. My sister-in-law paid us another visit a few days later and inquired about staying at our house when we were on our honeymoon. We assured her that we would let her know whether or not she was welcome to remain. My wife informed me that I had to accept this after we had decided on a plan since I had already caused her pain by not inviting her on our honeymoon. I was afraid that my sister-in-law's children would completely ruin my house in a few days, but I was unable to express my feelings. We offered to let my wife's sister stay at our house while we were on our honeymoon. She didn't. She brought all of her belongings and children the next day without even waiting for us to go. 3 days later, we departed for our honeymoon, and when we got back, nothing was there. The entire house was a complete mess because of my sister-in-law's children. It took us a week to tidy up and reorganize everything. My wife couldn't help but inform her sister that we were invited to a dinner party as a pair. My wife was informed by my sister-in-law that she would be joining us. I informed my wife that it was not feasible and that she needed to realize that we were the only ones invited as a pair. My wife was unable to go when she informed her sister that she couldn't. She asked if we could bring her children along. I was taken aback. I was unable to comprehend the nature of her personality. Angrily informed us that nobody else was invited and that we were the only ones. She was outraged about this and promised never to disturb us again. We brought a cake to her. My sister-in-law then disclosed that she was pregnant and too ill to take care of her home and kids after attending the dinner party to make amends. During her pregnancy, my wife grew anxious and requested if she might move into our 2-story home. I informed her that if she was really worried, she could leave and stay with her sister, but I would never allow her to remain at my place. My wife is not responding my calls or texts since she is visiting her sister. Right now, I'm trapped. I spoke with my wife at my sister-in-law's house. I attempted to explain to her that her preference for her sister was already having an impact on our married lives. She was understandably concerned about her sister, but it didn't imply she wouldn't care about other people, I reminded her. I persuaded her to accompany me back. After we arrived home and began eating supper, my wife began by stating that she was unable to leave her sister alone, and if she lived with us, what would have been wrong? The upper story has 2? I informed her that her sister's children were not at all calm and that I was not accustomed to live in an environment with loud noises. They would actually rush about wildly, smashing anything that got in their way. My wife informed me that we may limit them to the upper floor and that she was unable to leave her sister alone due to the boisterous nature of her sister's children. I insisted on telling her that I couldn't remain in the same location as those children. According to my wife, she had an idea. I could move in with my sister-in-law and she could stay at my house until she gave birth. I was astonished to learn that my wife continued by saying that I could easily remain at my sister-in-law's house because I didn't want to be with the kids. In order to allow my wife to care for her sister, both of the sisters could remain at my house as my sister-in-law's apartment only had 1 bedroom and could not house so many people. Apparently, There was nothing wrong with that because I remained silent. However, why would I move out with someone else? The following day, I just went to my room without arguing. My wife had packed my belongings and asked if I wanted to bring anything extra with me when I got home from work. We haven't made a decision yet, I informed her. She said that she couldn't wait and that I take too long to make decisions. She said I could go since her sister was leaving with her belongings, after that family arrived. I'm now waiting for my sister-in-law, and I still find this unbelievable. My wife had moved us, but I couldn't allow that to happen. So I went to my sister-in-law's house. I felt I had to speak up and tell them that they couldn't force me to do anything they wanted, even though I didn't want to cause any trouble at the moment. I made the decision to report my sister-in-law for trespassing on my land and my wife for helping her. I went to the police station 2 days later and made a report. I explained everything to the police. There is nothing I can do to get them all out of my house. When the police arrived at my house, they ordered my sister-in-law to leave right away and removed my wife from my home. My wife went to her sister's house because she couldn't believe I had reported them. She needed to choose who she truly cared about, so I didn't try to talk to her and let her leave. After unpacking and organizing my belongings, I had to clean the entire house because the kids had damaged everything within 3 days. My wife never thought I could be so insensitive, and she contacted me to tell me that I was the worst person in the world. She informed me that her sister's lack of approval for my marriage stemmed from her perception that I was completely unresponsible. I screamed at her, telling her that she only cared about her sister and that enough was enough. What was the reason for her marriage? She could only return if her sister realized that she needed to follow the boundaries, I informed her. After a few days without speaking to me, my wife called to ask if we might meet. I told her how much I loved her when I visited her. She pushed me because her sister was simply irrepressible, even though I never meant to behave that way. When I expressed my want for her to return, she responded that she shared my desire. She said that she would make an effort to set limits, respect them, and obey them before finally retaliating. However, that is understandable given his persistent efforts to keep his sister-in-law out of his affairs. However, she was unaware that there were boundaries and some privacy. Why OP's wife was so naive and failed to recognize that her sister was causing trouble all the time is beyond me. It was the responsibility of OP's wife to inform her sister that she was being intrusive, that she should not be involved in their life, and that the sister-in-law was a bitch. She sought to dominate OP's life by always being between them and had no life of her own. Why would anyone want to accompany a newlywed couple on their honeymoon? After that, she made sure to wreck OP's property while she was there. It was absurd to switch places with OP, and it was crap that OP's wife agreed with it. The next tale. Since I was 15, my friend, who is 34, and I have been great friends. I am a 31-year-old lady. Her hubby has been her spouse for 5 years. I've never been a huge admirer of his. I always thought there was something strange about him, but I never once said it to her or expressed my thoughts to her, because I had no reason to believe he was dishonest. You simply don't like people sometimes. They are not a horrible person because of that. And that's what I assumed it was. We do occasionally converse on social media because of our relationship through her. He S on my buddy list, although I don't see him very frequently. He made a move on me 3 nights ago, commenting on a photo I posted of myself at the beach with a buddy a few hours earlier and sending some quite flirtatious texts. Naturally, I was disgusted by this and asked him why he was doing it. I informed him that I was his wife's best friend and then inquired as to whether he was intoxicated. He made a hasty attempt to retract his writing and hide his ass, but it was obvious that he had been lying. He then pleaded with me not to tell her, but I chose to ignore him. After taking a snapshot of every conversation and storing it, I contacted my buddy early the next day to invite her to visit. Where? I explained everything to her. I had hoped to tell her face to face. Instead of emailing her every screenshot right away without any warning, would it be simpler to lessen the blow? She was unhappy with me, which shocked me because I anticipated her to be upset. She said that I must have somehow deceived him into believing that type of communication was okay. Said he would always be tempted before doing anything similar. I assured her that I would never treat someone that way. Finally, my closest buddy and I expressed our obvious distaste with what he had written. Then I told her that I was concerned because what was he doing with ladies who didn't know her if he was doing this to her best friend? She hasn't talked to me since we met that day and left me furious. Since then, I've messaged her a few times, but I haven't heard back. I hope she takes some time to process everything and that it's simply misdirected rage. I'm not sure what else I was meant to do. It must have been much terrible to dwell on this and keep it from her. You quote, really into your pal. And she probably knows about it since it's not the first time she's done this to other ladies. He has most likely always gaslighted her and offered reasons for it. That wouldn't surprise me. You truly done nothing wrong, therefore I'm very sorry you have to deal with this. If that were my spouse, I would definitely want to know. I sincerely hope she realizes her mistake and keeps you as a friend, since she will come to regret it. I would say NTA since my first spouse cheated on me for years. I believe you made the correct decision. However, I can also relate to her response. She loves and trusts her spouse, so seeing concrete evidence of treachery is extremely upsetting and devastating. She obviously doesn't want to think that he would act in this way without being provoked. You are the impetus behind what may be a significant shift in their relationship. Hopefully she will recognize that you behaved out of love for her, even if she may be angry with you for a while. Allow us some time and space to resolve this. However, it might be wise to get in touch and check on her. The next tale. Carly is a 12-year-old daughter of my spouse and me. She is a wonderful child, and I couldn't ask for more. She has handled the worldwide situation flawlessly, particularly after her father lost his airline career. He began working as a truck driver in March of last year, although his pay is far lower than what we were making before. Since Carly is just 12, she has a limited knowledge of the scenario. Every year, a new school organizes a trip. It frequently occurs at the end of the year with little warning. It's the same this year. We were given 3 weeks' notice to turn in the trip cash and authorization papers. Since 2019, there haven't been any for evident reasons. This year, my daughter's age group is going to a theme park. We were a little taken aback because of prior years. At least 6 weeks' notice was given to us. In fact, we had begun to think that this year it wouldn't happen. We had been saving for Carly's birthday, which is in early July, so we took a moment to sit down and tell her that she could either go on the school trip or do something with her friends, but that she couldn't do both. She wondered why the vacation was not possible, but she did select her birthday. I then pulled out some fictitious cash and contrasted it with her dad's previous salary. How things had to shift now. However, I also reassure her that she is still a child and that everything will improve. However, finances are a little tight right now. To help her feel less stressed, I didn't give her any actual numbers. Before her instructor summoned me for a meeting today, we assumed everything was fine. At the time, I thought, well, this is strange. The instructor reportedly overheard Carly discussing the problem with her classmates and declared that it was improper to explain financings and outgoings to a young student. I also placed my kid under needless stress by making her make a decision. I had to sow NTA after discussing it with a mother friend of mine, who concurred with the teacher. I wish more parents, my parents in particular, had been more forthcoming about the realities of money. It wasn't with my parents since I told them so, and I had just told them about our circumstances. I would have been much more cooperative and would have gained valuable life lessons at a young age. I was a bright and sensitive youngster. This instructor is completely incorrect. First of all, I think it's fantastic that you took the time to teach your daughter the importance of money, particularly because it's a life skill she will require. She has learned about budgeting from you, which is quite pertinent and appropriate for a 12-year-old. Her instructor reprimanding you for your parenting on the subject is inappropriate. Even still, I concur that financial problems belong to adults. She is still able to enjoy herself and rejoice because you reassured her about the circumstances. She was just given the opportunity to choose between 2 events that would honor her. I don't think there's much of a difference between this and asking kids how they want to budget and giving them an allowance. Final result, accept the present. She is also aware of her parents' low wages. You taught your daughter a lot about budgeting, prioritizing, making sacrifices, and living within your means. Well done, Mom. And